Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Living History. We are continuing the World War II theme this week with a number of things we've done. So we've done the Cara Breakout, we've done World War II tank crews, we've done a whole heap of World War II episodes recently, and I'm really enjoying it. And I know you are as well. We've had great feedback, so please keep sending those in and send in your comments and suggestions for the show as well, because some of our favourite episodes have come from your suggestions. So please keep sending those in. But today we're still in World War II. We're still in the Pacific. An interesting chapter. I'm really looking forward to exploring this because I think it's slightly controversial. It's not an area that I think we've spent a lot of time even thinking about, which is that period after the Second World War, war crime trials. You know, the Japanese put on trial for atrocities they committed in the Pacific. It's just a really interesting story, and I'm looking forward to it, especially off the prisoner of war stories we've been telling about the Cara Breakout. So I'm really looking forward to this. We're talking about a new book which is out at the moment, which is called The Witness. All about this topic, and it's written by a man by the name of Tom Gilling, who joins us now. Tom, thanks very much for joining us on Living History.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
It's an interesting topic, mate. I enjoyed the book, and an interesting chapter of history. I think to start, can you give us a little bit of context for how these prisoners came to be in Borneo in the first place, and just the historic background to what was happening in this area?
Well, like a lot of Australian soldiers, they were a lot came back from the Middle East, and they then came back to Australia and were going up to Singapore. And they arrived in Singapore just in time for Singapore to fall to the Japanese. So many Australian soldiers ended up spending most of their war as prisoners of war. And those who were very unfortunate ended up at Sandakan, which was a lot worse. We tend to think of Changi as being a hellhole. Well, some people describe Changi as a holiday compared to what they met at Sandakan in Borneo.
We did an episode on the Sandakan death marches a year or two ago, so if you want to go back and check that one out, please do, anyone listening to this podcast. But just give us some sort of idea, Tom, for what was going on in these camps, because the barbarity of the Japanese is very well known, but give us some specific examples of what life was like for the men that found themselves prisoners of the Japanese.
Well, at Sandakan, they were taken there to build an airfield. The Japanese wanted to build an airfield there, so they brought over a couple of thousand British and Australian POWs. It was brutal physical labour. They did have some machinery there, but that tended to be quickly sabotaged by the Australians. Some thought that was a bad move because it just meant the work was harder, but others felt that sabotage was contributing to the war effort. But the workload became steadily greater as they fell more and more behind schedule. And so consequently, the brutality from the guards in demanding more and more work, demanding the sick come out of hospital to work, demanding that those who were at the airfield were working pretty much from dawn until dusk, and those who didn't were beaten and subjected to pretty grotesque punishments.
Who were these Japanese that were guarding the camps? The reason I ask specifically is we've done a couple of podcasts lately off the back of my new book about the Cara Breakout, and so we spent a lot of time talking about Japanese prisoners in captivity and the Australians who were tasked with guarding them. What was the situation like in reverse? Who were the men that were guarding Australian and British prisoners, and where were they drawn from in the Japanese forces?
That's a very good question, Matt. The guards who were there early on were often soldiers themselves. They had been a lot of them had been frontline soldiers. They were there, I suppose, for various reasons. Maybe they'd been wounded, but they understood what it was like to be a soldier, and they were generally seen to be less brutal. But as the schedule became more hectic to try and build this airfield, Hoshijima, who was the commandant, started bringing in other guards. They were from Taiwan. They were from other places. They were Koreans, and they were younger. They hadn't been soldiers. There was no kind of common feeling with the experiences of an enemy soldier, and they were thugs. They inflicted the kind of violence that Hoshijima felt he needed in order to get the Australians to build his airfield.
I've heard some veterans say that they found that the Korean guards, in particular, were pretty tough on the prisoners. Is that was that your experience with the research that you've done?
That's certainly what a lot of the Australians felt. Yeah, it was hard to tell exactly where they were from because I quote a few examples of prisoners asking where they were from, and often the guards would say they'd name a Japanese city. But those who learned to speak a bit of Japanese, those prisoners who learned to speak a bit of Japanese, could pick up here and there that they weren't actually they weren't Japanese, they were Koreans. And the Koreans they were a subject people. They were colonized by Japan. They were brutalized by the Japanese throughout their time in the army. They probably thought they were fighting for the empire. They were actually being treated as the lowest of the low in the Japanese army, and they took it out on those who they had power over, and that was the prisoners.
It's probably one of the great ironies, isn't it, that the people themselves that were being subjugated by the Japanese were some of the most violent towards their prisoners. It's probably a subject for a whole other podcast, the psychology of what was going on. But you touched on it there. Is that what was happening because they were an oppressed people? Do you think they took the opportunity to take it out on the only people they had power over?
I think there's no doubt whatsoever about that. In fact, some of the Australians themselves saw the way the Koreans were treated by the Japanese, and they were on some occasions they were even sympathetic towards the kind of bastardry that they were suffering. But of course, the prisoners themselves then got it back from the Koreans. So yes, there's no doubt that the life of a Korean soldier in the Japanese army was pretty grim.
Tell us about the specific life for the prisoners in these camps. What were they fed? Where were they sleeping? Did they have access to medical treatment? Just give us an overview of what life was like in the camps.
In theory, they had access to medical treatment. They certainly had their own medical officers there, but they actually got access to very little medical treatment. The lot of the Japanese at Sandakan was not that great either, and so they were short of food towards the end. They were short of medicines towards the end. They were suffering the same kind of endemic diseases, malaria, dysentery, and so forth. Not nearly as badly as the prisoners, but it gave them a reason to be taking what food was available, stealing what drugs were available. The prisoners were supposed to receive Red Cross parcels, but Stipperwich gave a lot of evidence at the war crimes trials that he'd seen Japanese guards commanded by their officers opening Red Cross parcels of medicines. So food was very short for prisoners, much worse than it was for their guards, although towards the end of the war, even the guards were going hungry. But certainly they were getting a very poor diet, which gradually got worse in the course of the war. They got very little medical treatment, and they were living obviously in an environment that was full of diseases which could kill. Malaria being foremost.
How well constructed was the camp? Because obviously, unlike the Australian prisoner of war camps for Japanese prisoners, which were built in Australia, these camps were built not far from what was effectively the front line. So I can imagine they were fairly rudimentary in terms of the facilities and the living conditions for the prisoners.
Living conditions were pretty bad. Some of these places they were repurposed because they were sometimes had been internment camps for Japanese prisoners or Japanese civilians. And then when the Japanese invaded from 1942 onwards, they then were repurposed and the Europeans got put inside them. So they were often very shabbily built. Certainly, they were built in often deplorable places. They were built down near swamps where malaria was at its worst. But security was reasonably tight. I mean, not many people escaped, partly because it was hard to get out of the camps, but more because they were likely to be betrayed by the locals because the Japanese were brutal colonizers of the civilian population as well.
What was the Australian attitude to being a prisoner at this stage of the war? I understand they're all a mixed bag and everyone's going to have different attitudes, but in general, were the Australians always looking for opportunities to escape and cause trouble, or were they fairly resigned to their fate and just trying to see out the war as best they could?
My impression has been from this book and from the last book I wrote, which was about some prisoners who escaped from Sandakan, was that there were some who were bent on escaping from the moment they were forced to surrender, and there were others who were going to just try and make the best of it, knowing that they weren't going to get out, but hoping they might, hoping possibly that rescue operation might be mounted towards the end of the war. Um, it was very dangerous to escape. Your chances of getting out of the camp, well, some did manage to get out of the camp, but most were caught and shot pretty soon afterwards because they were handed over by the locals.
Yeah, pretty inhospitable environment as well to be roaming around without adequate food or water. Let's talk a bit about the Death March, because the most famous and the most brutal and tragic aspect of the Sandakan camps was the Death March. Just give us an overview of what that entailed.
Well, there are actually three death marches. There was one in January 1945, one in May, and then one just of the last few survivors a few weeks after that. The idea really was that the Japanese felt that at some point Sandakan was going to be invaded. The Americans and the Australians were moving, island hopping through the Pacific and gradually taking back what the Japanese had conquered earlier in the war. And they thought that there was going to be a landing at Sandakan, and so they started to move prisoners out to Ranau, which was about 250 kilometers out into the jungle. It was a very, very tough march. The jungle itself was bad enough, but Ranau was quite high, so there was a lot of climbing involved. It was a march. I mean, it was called a death march because many prisoners were too sick to even make complete the march under their own steam anyway. But many more were shot. Those who dragged their feet were shot by guards. So it was a few hundred did arrive at Ranau, but the conditions there were even worse than they had been at Sandakan. Several hundred were left behind at Sandakan. Those who couldn't even pretend to be able to walk were pretty much left on stretchers out in the open. The camp was burned, and they all died. But the 6 who did survive the death marches were some escaped en route, and 1 or 2 escaped after they'd got to Ranau.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, the numbers of the thousands of men who were sent on these marches, that we had 6 survivors. Just a brutal footnote to the time that these Australians and British troops had spent in captivity.
Well, that's right. The mortality rate of the 2,500 or so prisoners who were at Sandakan, 6 survived. The mortality rate was 99.75%.
Just absolutely horrific.
Far more, obviously, than for Australians who were prisoners of the Germans in Europe.
It's just it's a horrific part of the World War II story, and I don't think anyone who hears about this can have anything except absolute horror about it. But with your book, The Witness, you've found an interesting new approach to telling this story, and about Bill Sticpewich, a specific man, one of the 6 survivors. I'm not even going to spoil it. I'm just going to leave it to you to give us an overview of Bill Sticpewich and why his story is worth telling.
Well, I was interested in Bill Sticpewich because I noticed that his name came up in all of the books that have been written about Sandakan. He was never very favourably spoken of, and yet he was a witness to everything. He was when he arrived at the camp, he managed to talk the Japanese into having a technical party, of which he would be the leader. Now, he was a handyman, engineer, carpenter. The technical party did a bit of maintenance around the camp, did some odd jobs around the camp, did some favours for guards, fixing watches, mending buckets, that sort of thing. But what it meant was that Stipperwich and his technical party could avoid the heavy labour of building the airfield. They were fed a little bit better than the other prisoners were. And they also managed to evade that casual violence that all the prisoners who were at the airfield suffered. So he got himself on a pretty good wicket, and it gave him the run of the camp. So he was able to see everything and he remembered everything. He had an extraordinary memory, extraordinary recall of detail. And what that meant is, after the war, he is an absolute key documenter of what happened. Like the other five survivors, he gave statements after the war to Australian war crimes investigators, but where they might give 2 or 3 pages, Stipperwich would be talking on for 10, 15, 20 pages at a time. And so he's an invaluable witness to what happened. As I said, he featured in all those books, but there was something dark about Stipperwich. No one spoke well of him. A lot of them actively disliked or even hated him. And in fact, one of the 6 who escaped, Bill Moxham, when he heard that Bill Sticpewich had survived, he said to his colleagues, he said, "That bastard's still alive. I'm going to kill him with my bare hands." Now, clearly, here was a figure who was going to be interesting to pursue in the archives.
I've got so many questions about it, but firstly, how did Stipperwich himself survive? How was he one of the 6?
He was the last one to survive. He left it till very near the end, so he'd survived the march to Ranau. Those who had got to Ranau were dying like flies because the conditions up there were so appalling. There was virtually no food for anyone, and they weren't given any anyway by the Japanese, who knew they were going to die. So Stipperwich then heard from a guard. He learned a bit of Japanese, so he was able to communicate with the guards at Sandakan and then up at Ranau. And a guard tipped him off, who he'd got on quite well with, said, "There's going to be a massacre. Everyone's going to be killed." And that was when Stipperwich decided that it was time to go. He found one other partner to go with him. He wanted to go with someone, but pretty much everyone else was either incapable or 1 or 2 of the officers were unwilling to leave. But he found one other prisoner who was willing to go with him, and they slipped out just a matter of days before the last surviving prisoners at Ranau were all massacred.
Just horrific. I should ask, what rank was Stipperwich?
He was a warrant officer.
Okay. And why? I mean, given that he'd been through this ordeal alongside all the Australians and was one of the handful of survivors, and had been a witness and then obviously spoke in the trials about the atrocities committed by the Japanese, why was he so disliked by his fellow Australians?
He was accused of being a collaborator. So a collaborator, the term white Jap crops up in some of the transcripts of interviews, in the radio interviews in the 1980s, when prisoners started speaking out for the first time, really, to and the Australian public began to be interested in stories which hadn't really been told before then. And so he was accused of being a collaborator. Now, my feeling is he was a cooperator. I think a collaborator, it depends how you define it, but it's hard to find evidence of him actively working against prisoners, which I think you'd have to say would be a requirement if you're going to accuse someone of being a collaborator. But there's no doubt that he made himself indispensable to the Japanese. He did favors. He did things which many other prisoners would refuse to do. To them, the Japanese were the enemy. Whatever they told you to do, you didn't do it. Whatever work they asked you to do, you sabotaged it. Stipperwich had a different view. As I said, he learned a bit of Japanese. I think he thought that by communicating, by cooperating to an extent, you could achieve some kind of resistance that way, which you might not achieve by just flat out hostility. So, for example, he didn't have any role in building the secret wireless that they had in the camp, but it was given to him to hide, and he looked after it. And when the Japanese came looking for it, he managed to hide it somewhere else. He was part of a smuggling ring. He was an important part of a committee that organised smuggling of food into the camp, medicines into the camp for the sick prisoners in the hospital. There are plenty of examples of things that Stipperwich actually did for the prisoners, but I think many just drew the line at the kind of cooperation they saw from him. They also resented the fact that he was better fed. He was much fitter than they were towards the end of the towards the end of the march, he was much more capable of making the march because he hadn't got as badly sick as them. He'd avoided the violence. He didn't have the ulcers from injuries, and he was better fed. So all of those things, if you add those up, you can see why the charge of collaborator was made. But that to me seems a bit more than merited. I haven't seen evidence, haven't seen proof that he actively collaborated with the Japanese, but he certainly cooperated when many thought that was beyond the pale.
Did you find evidence of what his comrades thought of him in the army before he was taken prisoner?
I didn't know, but I tracked down in his war records. I found an interesting case from 1941 where he had just joined the army. He was up in Queensland, so this was before the Australians had been sent up to Singapore to fight the Japanese. And he was involved in this curious incident where some army beds were stolen. And 3 private soldiers accused him of him being part of a prank where they stole the beds. He was court-martialed, but before the court-martial happened, those 3 private soldiers went into the officer and they withdrew all their comments about having criticised Stipperwich. They withdrew their allegations against him. Now, I thought that was very interesting. There was no evidence that he had actively pressured them, but it was pretty clear that he had persuaded them in some way to retract those allegations against him. So there's very little about Stippewich's army history before he became a prisoner, but there were just 1 or 2 incidents like that which make you wonder about what kind of power he had over other soldiers and what he might have been up to. Maybe he was a chancer, but he covered his back.
How did you come across the story of Stipperwich, and what inspired you to write this book about him?
Well, as I said, when I heard that there are only 6 survivors of 2,500, and one of those wanted to kill Stipperwich, and several of the others made it sound like they wouldn't have been averse to that result either. He was obviously going to be a very interesting character, an ambiguous, challenging kind of character to explore, because he goes against that stereotype of the heroic prisoner or the sacrificial prisoner. There's a lot about him because he gave such detailed statements after the war. So you can pretty much follow Stippewich's wartime experience through these detailed statements that he gave in his own voice after the war. He was also brought in. He was viewed by the Australians after the war as such an authority on what happened that when the Japanese guards were interrogated, and these statements are in the War Memorial, you can find all these interrogation statements. At the bottom, it says, in many cases, dozens of cases, it says comment by Warrant Officer Stipperwich. And he would then say, this guard was okay. He never beat except under orders, or this guard was sometimes kind to prisoners, or this guard was one of the cruelest who was at the camp. And those comments by Stipperwich had a big effect on the fate of those Japanese guards when they came to be prosecuted.
How important was the evidence from Stipperwich personally in those war crimes trials?
I think it was central, actually, in the most important case, which was the case of Captain Hoshijima, who was the commandant at Sandakan. He was prosecuted by Athol Moffat, Captain Athol Moffat, as he then was. He became a Supreme Court judge, ran a Royal Commission into Organised Crime in New South Wales. Athol Moffat thought that Stipperwich was the bee's knees. He'd got Stipperwich's paper statements and he'd got written statements from the other prisoners, but he still felt that there was room there for Hoshijima to escape. But a couple of days before the trial started, Stipperwich, who was the only one fit enough to come and give evidence in person, arrived. Athol Moffat met him, and Athol's diary is at the War Memorial, and you can basically see him rubbing his hands. He thinks, now I've got him. He said, Stipperwich, he's a bit rough and ready, but he's a true Aussie, And he saw everything, he remembered everything, and I think we've got this. We've got Hoshijima now. Well, now that I've got Stipperwich, I'm confident that we're going to get the result.
And what did happen with Hoshijima?
Hoshijima was hanged. So Stipperwich gave the sort of evidence that Stipperwich gave against Hoshijima. Hoshijima said basically they were all starving because I wasn't getting enough food into the camp to be able to feed them, and I wasn't getting medicines, and hence my soldiers were getting sick as well. But Moffat was able to point out that half a dozen Japanese soldiers died of sickness in Sandakan, but hundreds of Australians died of sickness, whereas Hoshijima was claiming that the treatment was the same. But Stipperwich trotted into the witness box and was able to give chapter and verse on specific acts, like he had seen prisoners sent to the cage, which was a bamboo cage where prisoners were left for days, sometimes for weeks. Very little food and water, no protection from the elements. He was able to say, I saw these prisoners go in the cage and I saw Hoshijima watching them. He claimed he'd seen violence by Hoshijima personally, and also he had found bags of rice. He'd seen 300 bags of rice under the commandant's hut, whilst the Australian prisoners were starving to death for lack of rice. He'd also observed Japanese guards opening Red Cross medical parcels that were meant for the prisoners. All of those things, the cage, the deliberate starvation when there was rice available, all of those counted very heavily against Hoshijima. And in the end, there was nothing he could say to counter the evidence that Stipperwich was able to present.
Tom, I'm in two minds about Stipperwich at this point. On one hand, we have he seems from your description to be one of those guys that would be disliked in the army, that in this environment he'd do what it took to survive. He'd cooperate with the Japanese when required, a little bit every man for himself. But at the same time, as you say, he still was hiding the radio, he was assisting where he could, and his evidence was instrumental in bringing these men to justice. So let's just lay it on the line. How should we remember him 80 years after the fact?
I think it's hard to answer that question without actually asking another question, which was, how would you survive? How would anyone survive in that camp under those conditions with that amount of violence, lack of food, sickness? How would you survive? I don't think that Stipperwich was alone in putting his own survival ahead of every other issue that he came across. I think many felt like that. But Stipperwich was an unusually capable man. He was lucky as well. I mean, he didn't get seriously ill. He didn't suffer the kind of injury that might have led to a tropical ulcer, that might have led to having a leg amputated, which might have meant that he couldn't complete the march. He was undoubtedly lucky, although I spoke to his great nephew, Ben, in Canberra, who had one or two stories that I hadn't read in the archives at all. Like, for example, he said that whenever it rained, Stipperwich used to take all his clothes off and wash himself in the rain with gravel while he was at the camp. Now, that seems a crazy kind of behavior, but it would have kept him clean. It was, dirt was a killer in a camp like that when there was so much disease around. And if just that one thing, that he made sure his body was as clean as he could make it for the time he was there, that said something about him making his own luck. So he was definitely, there was an element of luck. But I think that question of he did what he needed to survive. Many others did what they needed to in the hope of surviving. He pushed the line more than most. You're quite right. There's no question that when you read about his behaviour, many would have thought that it was collaborating. And many would have seen his selfishness as, he's against the archetype of someone like Weary Dunlop. So the story of Weary Dunlop is a man who was brave, stood up to the Japanese, a heroic doctor who put his own life at risk in order to save the lives of the sick men he was looking after. But conditions weren't as bad for Weary Dunlop in Changi and elsewhere as they were at Sandakan. So it's possible that all the other medical officers at Sandakan died. Perhaps someone like Weary Dunlop might have died as well. It was an exceptional character who survived those kind of conditions, and all of the 6 who did survive were scallywags in different ways. They were stealers of food. One of them escaped at the end. They went to talk to one of the medical officers and asked him if he would go, and he said, I don't think I'm up to it. And the reason he wasn't up to it was because one of those 6 had stolen his boots just before. So even if he'd wanted to go on the march, he would have been unable to. So all of those 6, they all represented in some way people who were prepared to do things that the rest of that 2,500 might not have been willing to do. And they survived partly through luck, but partly because they were so determined, and they were, they were ratbags. They were not following the rules. They were slipping out at night and getting extra food. I think that's what it took to survive those conditions.
I know through my own work, Tom, that when you research these characters, when you spend enough time in the archives and reading about them in their own words, you start to form an opinion and a bond with them. How do you feel now about Stipperwich after all these years? Is he someone you like? Is he someone you respect? Do you have sympathy for him? How do you feel about him, having written this book?
Well, I think it's important to try and look at the whole story of Stipperwich, and so a lot of what he did while he was at the camp was criticised, made him deeply disliked. But after the war, he was, as you've said, he was an invaluable witness at the war crimes trials. So he was instrumental in bringing a lot of those guards to justice. Several of them were hanged. But there was another task he performed in the years after the war, which was many hundreds of prisoners, of Australian and British prisoners, had died on those death marches, and no one knew where they were buried. Some of them had died of sickness. Some of them had been shot or bayoneted by the guards, and their bodies were just left by the path, or they were thrown into the jungle. Now, no one knew where they were. Stipperwich made it a point after he survived to find the bodies of his comrades from the POW camp, and he worked, I think, tirelessly with the War Graves unit, researching areas that he considered that had not been satisfactorily researched. And he found himself, he was responsible for finding hundreds of bodies that would not have been found. Now, there were families back home in Australia wondering what had happened to their fathers, their sons, their husbands. The Australian government wasn't telling them very much because the Australian government was a bit ashamed of what had happened at Sandakan, that rescue might have been possible, but nothing was done to save those 2,500 men. The Australian government was not, and the Australian army was not keen on telling the story of Sandakan after the war. So a lot of families would have known very little if it hadn't been for Stippewich's efforts to find their bodies and make sure they were properly buried.
Well, he sounds like a complicated character in a complicated situation. I really enjoyed using his story to paint a new picture of Sandakan and life for those POWs. It's a really fascinating read. The book is called The Witness. It is available now across Australia, and I thoroughly recommend it. Just a really great read. Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us all about it.
Thanks, Matt. I really enjoyed coming.